She was 70 years old and they hacked her to pieces. The first blow missed her neck entirely. She ran. The executioner chased her. It took 11 strokes before she stopped screaming. This wasn't a secret execution in some forgotten dungeon. It happened in broad daylight in the Tower of London, witnessed by horrified onlookers. Margaret Pole's death wasn't just a miscarriage of justice. It was a deliberate act of royal sadism, and Henry VIII, the man behind it, wasn't just satisfied. He was pleased. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, wasn't some obscure noble. She was the last surviving member of the Plantagenet dynasty, a living symbol of a royal bloodline that had ruled England for centuries before the Tudors seized the throne. Born in 1473 to George, Duke of Clarence, and thus niece to two kings, Edward IV and Richard III, Margaret was deeply entrenched in the web of royal claims and counterclaims. But after decades of cautious survival and quiet loyalty, she became the focus of one of the most brutal and politically charged executions in Tudor history. It was May 27, 1541. England had been convulsed by decades of religious upheaval, dynastic paranoia, and increasingly violent repression. And Henry VIII, once the charming golden prince of Europe, had transformed. No longer the dancing king with a Renaissance court, he had become obese, paranoid, and merciless. Anyone with a hint of rival blood or wavering loyalty could end up under the axe. Margaret, in his eyes, was both, but contemporary accounts often sanitize what really happened to her. They reduce her death to a footnote, a casualty of Tudor politics. What they rarely capture is the horror of her final moments and the psychological cruelty that preceded them. Margaret wasn't just executed. She was humiliated, imprisoned without charge, stripped of her dignity, and finally butchered by an unskilled headsman. It was a message, not a sentence. So why her? Why then? And why did Henry VIII, a man who had once considered Margaret a family friend, personally sign off on one of the most gratuitously violent executions of his reign? To answer that, we have to go back not just to Margaret's lineage, but to the paranoia and shifting alliances of Henry's court. Because her blood made her dangerous, and her composure made her defiant. This wasn't just a woman sent to the block. This was the slow destruction of a symbol. Her story is one of survival turned into spectacle, and her death would echo far beyond the stone walls of the tower. But before we reach that final grisly act, we need to understand how Margaret Pole, a grandmother, a patron of learning, a woman of dignity and age, became one of Henry VIII's most hated targets. What happened behind the palace walls? What forces twisted justice into vengeance? And how did the old world of chivalry and nobility collapse into the blood-drenched nightmare of Tudor tyranny? This is not just the story of one woman's horrific end. It's a story about power fear and how even the highest birth couldn't protect you from a king who believed God himself had crowned him to rule. And once we uncover what Margaret endured and how deliberately it was orchestrated, we may finally see why her death wasn't a mistake or even a necessity. It was a statement. Margaret Pole's fall did not happen overnight. It was a slow unraveling drawn out over years, shadowed by suspicion and sharpened by political pressure. When Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England, it wasn't just religious tradition that he tore apart. He fractured loyalties, scattered centuries of alliances, and created a kingdom where silence could be fatal and faith could be treason. And Margaret, devoutly Catholic, became an island of resistance within a sea of forced conformity. She had long managed to navigate the treacherous waters of Tudor politics, raising her children with care, keeping her distance from court intrigue, and focusing on charitable and religious work. She founded schools, protected scholars, and even had a close relationship with the future Queen Mary. But none of this mattered once the tide turned. Once her son, Reginald Pole, began to openly criticize Henry from abroad, Condemning the king's divorce and his seizure of church property, Margaret's fate was sealed. Guilt by association became a death sentence. Reginald, once a favored courtier, had fled to Rome and aligned himself with the Pope. From there, he launched theological and political attacks on Henry, calling him a heretic, an illegitimate ruler, a destroyer of the true faith. To Henry, this wasn't just defiance, it was betrayal from within the bloodline. And Margaret, still in England, became a proxy target for the venom the king could not yet direct at her exiled son. The descent began with whispers. Her estates were surveyed, her letters intercepted. Friends vanished or stopped visiting. She was removed from court. Then came the arrest. It wasn't grand or dramatic. Soldiers arrived at her home, and Margaret, aged, dignified, and unarmed, was taken to the Tower without explanation. She was never formally charged, never granted a trial. There were no witnesses, no confessions, only a pretext that she had supported her son's treason, that she possessed a tunic with the 5 wounds of Christ, a symbol used by Catholic rebels. Even this was never proven. It didn't need to be. Inside the Tower, the psychological pressure deepened. Margaret was kept in cold, sparse conditions. Her ladies were dismissed, her servants replaced with guards. Letters from family went unread or unanswered. The once vibrant matriarch was isolated, reduced to a name on a list and a body in a cell. And yet she never confessed. She never begged. Reports say she remained composed, even kind, during interrogations. Her resilience in the face of erasure only seemed to aggravate the men who demanded her submission. Henry, meanwhile, was transforming into something darker. By the early 1540s, he had already executed 2 wives and dozens of noblemen. His ulcerated leg, his obesity, his spiraling paranoia, all fed a mind that saw threats everywhere. And Margaret, with her ancient blood and unwavering faith, became a mirror he could not bear. Her very existence questioned the legitimacy he fought to maintain. She was a memory of the world he had destroyed, and in her silence there was judgment. So what happens when a king drunk on power and haunted by ghosts finds himself face to face with the last living echo of a rival dynasty? He strikes, and not with precision but with fury. But even that fury, as we shall see, could not anticipate the chaos that would erupt on the scaffold. The morning of Margaret Pole's execution was grim and grey. The Tower of London, cold and damp, with the breath of history, prepared once more to swallow another victim. But this was not a standard affair. There was no formal trial, no declaration of guilt, no priest offering last rites. Margaret was simply told she was to die that day. No one knew who gave the order, but everyone knew who wanted it. When the guards came to her cell, they found a woman who refused to cower. 70 years of noble blood held her spine straight. She walked with quiet dignity through the stone corridors, past the walls that had once echoed with royal feasts, now filled only with the silence of dread. Outside, the small crowd gathered, curious, grim-faced, whispering. Few dared meet her eyes. The execution site was hastily arranged within the precincts of the Tower itself, away from the usual spectacle of Tower Hill. It was meant to be discreet, almost clinical. But nothing about what followed could be called controlled. Margaret Pole was not sentenced by a court. She had not confessed. This was not justice. It was liquidation. The headsman was young. Some say he was untrained. Others claim he was drunk. What is certain is that he missed. The first blow struck her shoulder. Margaret, bleeding and stunned, instinctively turned and tried to flee. In that moment, the execution ground became a hunting ground. The crowd gasped. Guards moved forward. The headsman followed, axe in hand, swinging wildly. It took 11 blows to end her life. 11. Witnesses were horrified. One chronicler described it as a scene from a nightmare, the woman running the axe, flashing the screams. A foreign ambassador later wrote home saying that even among executions this one would be remembered as an abomination. And yet back in the palace Henry received the news with cold satisfaction. He had rid himself of a threat. A symbol had been extinguished. But was that all he saw, or did he take pleasure not just in her death, but in the method of it, in the chaos? In the spectacle, Henry by then had lost much of his humanity. The boy king who once studied theology and poetry had become a tyrant fed by pain. And Margaret Pole, in her refusal to break, may have reminded him of everything he couldn't control. Her dignity was a defiance, and her horrific death to him was proof of his absolute power. As the blood soaked into the tower's soil, the silence after the last scream was deafening. No words were spoken, no honors were given. Her body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where so many others' wives, nobles, martyrs, had also been laid in anonymity, but her name was not forgotten. What happened on that scaffold was more than an execution. It was a descent into madness, the kind that comes not just from cruelty, but from a king staring into the mirror of history and striking to erase what he saw. The mourning faded, but the horror lingered. News of Margaret Pole's death spread like wildfire, whispered from courtier to courtier, etched into the memory of every trembling witness who had watched it unfold. The air around the tower remained heavy, as if the very stones retained the echoes of her screams. This wasn't just a killing, it was a rupture in the fabric of decency, even by Tudor standards. And yet, within the glittering halls of Whitehall, the king moved on. Henry VIII showed no public remorse. There were no proclamations, no justifications, no words to address what had happened. That silence was louder than any speech. In the days that followed, foreign envoys expressed shock, quietly noting the savagery of the act in their dispatches home. The French and imperial courts, often at odds for once, found common ground condemnation, but they also knew better than to provoke the fury of a king who had shown what he was capable of. Among the English nobility, the execution chilled the blood. Margaret Pole had been one of them. If her lineage, her age, her piety, and her connection to royalty couldn't save her, then no one was truly safe. Trust became rarer. Loyalty became transactional. At court, eyes avoided eyes. Nobles whispered behind fans and tapestries. Every smile held a sliver of fear. In her death, Margaret had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of the unpredictable wrath of absolute power. And those who had once seen the Tudors as the harbingers of stability now saw in them something darker, a dynasty willing to bleed history dry to keep its throne. As for her family, the blow was shattering. Reginald Pole in Rome received the news in silence. He had long feared that his resistance would cost his mother dearly, but nothing could have prepared him for the brutality of her final hour. He never returned to England. Instead, he continued to fight Henry through pen and prayer, later rising to become Archbishop of Canterbury under Queen Mary. But the loss of his mother would haunt him forever. In his writings, he rarely mentioned her death. Perhaps the words were too painful to form. Back in England, Margaret's grave remained unmarked for centuries. In a quiet corner of the chapel, among other victims of royal displeasure, she lay beneath the stone floor, a queen in all but name, buried without ceremony. But time did not forget her. Generations later, during the Catholic revival under Mary, her memory was invoked as that of a martyr. The Church beatified her in 1886, recognizing her not just as a noblewoman, but as a symbol of faith in the face of tyranny. The political landscape continued to shift. Henry grew more isolated, his court more paranoid. The same machinery that had crushed Margaret eventually turned on his own inner circle. Even his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, narrowly escaped arrest. The blood of a Plantagenet had not satisfied the hunger of Tudor power. And yet, for all the chaos she endured, Margaret Pole never broke. That final image of her wounded running, refusing to kneel, wasn't just tragic, it was heroic. In the face of illegitimate authority, she held on to her truth. In an age when silence was survival, she dared to be silent without surrender. It is here in that silence where we find the deeper tragedy, not just the loss of a woman, but the extinguishing of a lineage, a moral compass, a link to a more principled past. Her death wasn't merely the end of her story, it was a signpost, one that warned of what happens when fear becomes law, and when power forgets its soul. In the long shadows of history, Margaret Pole's story refuses to fade. Her execution may have been orchestrated as an erasure, a blotting out of a rival claim, a cleansing of inconvenient blood, but it became something far more enduring. It became a lesson. The immediate aftermath saw little resistance. Fear kept tongues still and pens dry. But in time, historians, theologians, and even monarchs revisited her fate, asking not only how such cruelty was allowed, but what it meant for England itself. Margaret's death had not just ended a life. It had illuminated the terrifying depth of Henry VIII's transformation. The man who once sought wisdom had become a ruler obsessed with obedience, a king who believed survival was best secured through terror. Yet as history marched forward, so did the memory of the woman who stood silently against that tide. In Catholic circles, Margaret Pole was remembered as a martyr, not because she took up arms or defied the crown with force, but because she endured. Her silence became testimony, her composure defiance. And in the centuries that followed, her image shifted from noblewoman to icon, from victim to warning. Modern historians see in her story a convergence of so many Tudor themes: the volatility of absolute power, the erasure of the old nobility, the brutal enforcement of ideological conformity. She was not the only one to suffer under Henry's regime, but few suffered with such visibility, and fewer still with such tragic symbolism. Margaret was not just executed, she was erased on paper, then immortalized by the very violence meant to destroy her. Her legacy is preserved not in monuments, but in lessons, about how fear is weaponized, about how silence can be more powerful than shouts, about how rulers, even those anointed by divine right, can fall prey to their own shadows. And for England, her death marked a point of no return. The Plantagenet dream was truly over. The Tudor nightmare at its darkest was fully realized. Today, visitors to the Tower of London walk the same stones she did. They gaze at the chapel where she lies, and though her name might not ring as loudly as some queens or conquerors, her presence is there in the quiet, in the weight of the past, in the feeling that justice sometimes speaks clearest through injustice. And what of Henry, the king who signed her death warrant, died bloated, bitter, and alone, his kingdom fearful, his name tainted? The memory of his grandeur, his towering figure, his glittering court was forever shadowed by the blood he spilled. And Margaret Pole's name, once meant to be forgotten, rose from beneath the stone. So what does her death teach us now, in a time far removed from swords and scaffolds, that power unmoored from conscience becomes tyranny? That heritage can be both shield and target, and that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, the human spirit can resist in silence, in dignity, in the refusal to bow. If her life began as a promise to a noble house, it ended as a lesson for all, a lesson that echoes still. If this story stirred something in you, if you want to uncover more truths buried by time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and dive into our next story on the final moments of George IV, where opulence met decay in a chamber of secrets.